Yo, it's been a while since I've made one of these videos, but that's also because we haven't had a new class in a long time. The last one being Breaker about a year ago. We had a gap where there was no class release because the whole ARK passive system came out, which kind of took the spotlight away from new classes for a second. So Wild Soul came out last month, and this is the third specialist class after Aeromancer, and it is also a DPS class. Initially, she was very weak with a lot of complaints about her clunky playstyle in both engravings, but as of the last patch in late January, both builds became notably much more comfortable to play, along with just newer, stronger builds appearing from theory crafters, including myself. This video will mainly focus on the Wild Awakener build, which is a crit primary and swift secondary playstyle, as that's the one I've primarily tested and theory crafted. The main researcher leading the Wild Instinct build, which is spec main and crit secondary on the Korean side, is a well-renowned player Porcelain. He recently pioneered two particularly popular builds that are just named 323 and 413, which refer to the number of each type of skill taken between box, spare, and non-transformation, respectively. As a disclaimer, I fully believe that at this time, the spec build is considered more powerful in overall damage, as well as burst, of course. The spec version definitely errs on the side of unbalanced at this time of the video posting, rivaling potential damage of the existing strongest classes in the game, classes like Arcana or RE Deathblade. Now, from here on, for this video's sake and my sake, the Wild Awakener build, or the crit build, is just going to be referred to as Crit Wild Soul. This build doesn't share any specific similarities to existing classes. The deal structure revolves around a very brief identity building phase. Think Legacy Scouter brief, so it's just actually a couple seconds, followed by activating your identity and an opener. Afterwards, you have a choice between waiting around 12 seconds for your next burst, followed by another 12 seconds after that for another burst, or backloading both the second and the third bursts back to back after about 24 seconds. So again, you have the choice of bursting at the start, middle, and end, or at the start and then like a mega burst at the end with nothing in the middle. How you do this is actually based off how you use her identity skill. The latter decision can be helpful when you want to squeeze as much damage as possible into a big Atrophin window. There are two popular builds in Korea for Crit Wild Soul, which I'll refer to as 4-4 and 5-3. 4-4 is considered a safer build that has 4 identity builders and can maintain your class synergy, which is 12% defense down easier. 5-3, which is the version that I play, uses one less identity builder in lieu of another attack skill. Please keep in mind that at this time, I play a unique version of this build that I made myself that no one else currently uses in Korea. I'll explain later in the video as to why. Now about her identity, when you activate it, your Wild Soul will take on a new appearance with a foxtail and ears. Your spacebar cooldown is instantly reset and replaced with a new snappier version. With access to her later Enlightenment node in the ARK passive tree, she's also able to hold 2 spacebar stacks for added mobility and safety. A quick thing about her identity, while it's not activated, it will automatically slowly recover without having to do anything, even when out of combat. You gain identity when attacking enemies too, but this is on top of the automatic recovery. She can also deactivate her identity state manually with the default X key if you need to, depending on the pacing of the fight. And as a little added bonus, this is peak modern design, but if you ever wipe in a pull, she respawns with full identity gauge. and that's the gauge in the center. The gauges on the left and the right, which are the fox and bear meters, this build does not utilize them, so you can just straight up ignore them. While in your identity state, you also gain 20% attack speed and movement speed, as well as 60% more flat crit damage. Unfortunately, that crit damage isn't actually very useful, but we'll talk about why in the skill section of the video. The key part of this class, though, is a system called spirit stacks. While in your identity state, you gain 1 spirit stack as long as there's at least 1 enemy within 24 meters of you passively per second. This doesn't require you to attack anything. It's purely automatic, so you'll even gain these stacks if you're focused on dodging key enemy attacks. At any time that you wish, you can press the Z key to consume all stacks that you currently have in order to reduce all current cooldowns by 5% per stack, as well as recover 2% max mana per stack as well. This maxes out at 20 stacks, which if used at this point will entirely refresh all of your cooldowns, excluding the hyperskill and awakening. This sounds somewhat complicated, but all you need to know is that your identity state lasts up to 30 seconds, and in that time, you'll use 3 cycles of your main damage skills. Just like I mentioned before, you'll either do 1 at the start, 1 in the middle, and 1 at the end, or you'll do 1 at the start and 2 at the end. This all depends on when you decide to consume the spirit stacks. The first strategy revolves around using the spirit stacks immediately after you finish using your 4 main damage skills. You don't wait for the 5th skill because that one has a very low contribution relative to the rest. The second strategy is to hold until you have 20 stacks, which is just about the time where your skills will come off cooldown just naturally. And that way, after you use your skills, you can pop a 20 stack and immediately use your skills again. So to summarize, you either use the spirit stacks right after every main cycle, or you hold for 20 and then do a back-to-back at the end. This all depends on if you want to backload the damage or not. Core engravings for Crit Wild Soul include Grudge, Adrenaline, and Raid Captain. You spend very little time outside of your identity form, so you'll basically have close to 100% Raid Captain efficiency throughout a fight. Optional engravings beyond that include Cursed Doll, Hitmaster, MP Efficiency, Precise Stagger, and of course, Ether Predator. As a general reminder, any of these engravings at their relic tier is going to be a better option than an alternative that's only at legendary. The reason Keen Blunt Weapon isn't an option is the same reason why Precise Dagger is a valid option. Crit Wild Soul has the highest crit damage of any class in the entire game, averaging between 550 to 650% crit damage across all of her abilities, including the hyperskill. This means that you must build around 100% crit chance no matter what, and Blunt Thorn can never be an option. It also means that obtaining crit damage on your rings isn't worth the gold cost, and that you must pursue additional damage on your pants elixirs. Speaking of elixirs, there's only 2 options, standard for most DPS. Master for when you need the crit chance to get close to 100%, and critical for when you have excess crit chance. Personally, I cut both, and when I have a crit synergy in the party, I switch to a preset that uses critical elixirs instead, since it's a desaturated damage multiplier. Mainly through the first and second rows of the evolution ARK passive tree, if plausible, and avoid using Zealous Smite on the 3rd row. The reason for this is because you'll want a little bit of CDR from Unlimited Magic for comfort reasons, but Unlimited Magic also provides decent damage as well as mana cost reduction. You want to prioritize raw damage after you've reached 100% crit chance like this. Wild Soul is an extremely mana-hungry class, and you should be prepared to use mana food on her if you don't plan to use MP efficiency. All of her abilities use MP, so you'll get 100% efficiency from that engraving at the cost of just 1% from the engraving compared to an alternate choice. For my own personal engravings, I'm running Grudge, Adrenaline, Raid Captain, Cursed Doll, and Hitmaster. While Hitmaster doesn't impact the Awakening nor the roll skill, I found that it was still a better overall choice in damage versus using Precise Dagger and stacking more swiftness, which yielded little benefits. Regarding her gems, I ended up using 6 damage gems and 5 cooldown gems. One of the gems is on a fairly low contributing skill called Fox Slap, and I just found that there was no better place to use this gem for anything else. All the main skills already had a damage and cooldown gem, and putting CDR gems on any of the other builders just made no sense because they were always available to use to build the identity before the next cycle began anyways. Using the CDR gem on them just wouldn't have done anything at all. And so we just grabbed more damage with it. Now I want to take some time to talk about swiftness as a stat in general for her. For about a week, I really tried to make a swiftness build work. Especially because I play on higher ping, it sometimes felt tight to fit in 3 damage cycles, specifically the last one at the tail end of your identity. But inherently, swiftness simply doesn't work well, because all builds of Crit Wild Soul generate spirit stacks at the same 1 per second rate. Even if you play swiftness, you generate these stacks at the same speed as a crit build. And the benefit of these stacks will interact differently with your cooldown reduction rate. Let's say, for example, your major skill has 10 seconds cooldown while swift build, but 16 while crit build. That's a pretty big difference. But let's say in both cases, you have 10 spirit stacks and use them at the same time. Again, in both cases. The swift build would go down to 5 seconds, while the crit build would go down to 8 seconds. Do you see how the swiftness build wouldn't be able to take advantage of her identity as much now? Meanwhile, the crit build doesn't have to sacrifice evolution ARK passive nodes or her engravings to make up for the crit needed for 100% and can instead opt for more raw damage. In the second week, when I switched back from swift to crit, I saw a Trixian DPS gain of over 9%. To this end, you really want enough cooldown reduction where you can comfortably 3-cycle your abilities and no more than that. It's also a strong consideration when cutting a bracelet that swiftness in general is relatively low value on her, albeit still is the second best option after crit. It can easily be replaced, however, by main stat or attack and movement speed on the locked lines if you wanted to lower the cost of the attempts. For what it is worth, it is possible but basically with max level gems, to fit 4 cycles of skills, and that's running maximum CDR in the evolution tree in one identity, but it is insanely tight and just not reasonable, either in cost or functionally in a real raid scenario. Next, I want to talk about something that I call the roll tech. The roll tech is what I based my build around. It's an interaction that I discovered but didn't share with the Korean community, mainly because I don't have an Invent account to post there. Wild Soul has a non-transformation skill, Degulbanga. This skill name, much like a lot of her other skill names, is onomatopoeia, so for the video's sake, I'm just gonna call it her roll skill moving forward. This attack rapidly rolls forward and slams into the enemy, similar to Sonic the Hedgehog. While researching off-meta Swift builds, I discovered that this skill will sometimes hit twice, dealing double damage. This occurs when taking the tripod called Stable Landing in the second row, which increases the damage of the ability and lets you quickly recover from the attack when making impact with the enemy. When achieving a certain attack speed with this attack, it triggers an on-contact instance of damage, as well as a second instance of damage when bouncing off the target. This speed I found to be 128% attack speed when combined with a legendary Galewind rune. Going higher is okay, and going lower results in randomness, whether or not the second hit happens at all. The Galewind rune is necessary for this to work. At 140% attack speed and no Galewind rune, which is the speed cap before casting speed is even involved, the rolling skill fails to double hit most of the time. Now, the rolling skill itself isn't particularly strong. Hell, in terms of damage contribution, even with both hits, it only lands as the 5th highest damage contributor, only barely beating out Fox Slap. The reason why this skill is important is because it doesn't just double the damage, but rather it doubles the hits, and therefore doubles the amount of identity gained. For this reason, my build aims to reach 128 to 129% attack speed outside of the identity form, so that we can easily drop the weak skill called Yap and use the roll skill not only to do damage, but build identity fully before the bear punch comes off cooldown, as well as apply the class synergy. Rolling essentially becomes this all-encompassing ability. Next, we'll talk about her utility. And when we're talking about utility, we're mainly discussing 3 key abilities of a class. How good is their counter? Is their stagger reliable and high? And can they contribute a lot of weak point damage? That's also the order of the relative importance of those traits in general as well, with having a good counter usually being the most important and having high weak point damage being the least. For Crit Wild Soul, the counter ability is called Scratch. This skill is pretty slow, all things considered, but covers a very wide range to the left and right, allowing for some pretty interesting counter potential so long as the Wild Soul themselves are positioned in front of the boss. Leveling the skill to 4 is essential, as at its base, it doesn't even have paralysis immunity and can easily be interrupted. Leveling it to 7 is ideal, but not entirely necessary, as this level grants it a 4-meter built-in dash. Without it, the skill is stationary, which you could technically play around in order to allocate more points to Fox Slap, but I wouldn't recommend it. In my build, Scratch is only level to 7, which means it's pretty much just used for adrenaline maintenance and identity building, and is often up when you do need it for actual counters. The base cooldown is also only 12 seconds, which is further lowered by your spirit stacks. When talking about her stagger, nearly all of her core skills deal between 80 and 110 units of stagger damage, which is generally good. However, if we exclude her main damage abilities, her stagger can feel a bit lacking, which may be the case if a stagger check has DR and you don't want to use your main damage skills on it. Let's say you just want to hold back on damage, finish the DR check, and then unload your damage. It is worth noting that the roll skill, when hitting twice, will also inflict twice as much stagger as well, giving it similar stagger damage to most of your bigger hitting attacks. Lastly, regarding her weak point, at her base, 1 round of attacks from Crit Wild Soul has a total of 5 skills that deal 1 weak point on them each. However, it's also possible to add 1 more weak point to up to 4 of these skills for a max of 9. Doing this will deselect the reduced mana cost tripod, however, so do consider potential mana issues if you move any of these. Now, about Crit Wild Soul's Karma, she actually has unimportant side nodes. One node increases her damage by 1% and reduces mana cost by 2% per level. Nice to have, but not essential. The other node introduces a 10% chance to increase any given attack's damage by 12% per level, maxing out at 60% at level 5. This effectively maths out to a 1.2% damage increase per level. Again, not very important. This means that Wild Soul can comfortably park at 96 Enlightenment points if you want to work on Leap first without disrupting her general gameplay. It is a good thing to get her last mainline Enlightenment node to at least level 1 for quality of life, as that's what enables her 2-charge spacebar while in her identity state. Beyond that, it's just a general damage increase. For her Leap tree, both options are pretty valid for the hyper skill. The name of it is also onomatopoeia, and I won't try to translate it. For her first option in the second row of the Leap tree, it increases the radius of the skill and the crit damage by a large amount. For the second option, it increases the raw damage and lowers the cooldown by 10% at all levels. So it's 10% at 1, 2, and 3, not 30% total. The former of the options hits harder in a single instance by roughly 10%, and so generally I just didn't bother with the other one. As for her regular awakening, Wild Brawl, it does pretty good damage in a large area. Usually you can chuck it in along with any regular damage rotation. The Hyper Awakening version also deals respectable damage on the higher side among all class Hyper Awakenings. For shorter fights, I just run Hyper Awakening damage, but for longer fights like Act 2 or Act 3, I think Hyper Skill cooldown will yield better results. Even 2 additional casts of the Hyper Skill will outperform the damage gained on the Hyper Awakening. I'll quickly go over other modes since I did that in other videos, just for those curious. In Chaos Dungeon, I haven't found a build in Chaos Dungeon that feels really comfortable to play. If anything, these crow sounds are really damn annoying, but it's relatively safe all in all. The Crow March ability keeps you moving, so you don't really take any damage even in higher frontline dungeons. And I haven't ran Wild Soul in Hell mode myself at this time. Currently, most people that do play it in Hell mode use the Spec build. Even though Spec builds are historically not as good in Hell mode compared to their Swift counterparts, Wild Soul is one of the exceptions. For those who are Hell enthusiasts, I can say with confidence that Wild Soul is one of the strongest classes in Hell in the current balance. For a frame of reference, I've seen her score 25% Cruel Fighter in a Hell Brawl run that faced 7x at 1 minute and 5 seconds to spare on the Enrage with only 1 person dead. That kind of contribution with that much time remaining would be considered strong for sure. As far as gameplay quirks go, I would say that she only has one that feels kind of strange, besides for the fact that a lot of her skills have a slight delay to them, so sometimes you could miss a boss that makes a rapid movement, either forward, back, or just straight up disappears. Sometimes you can't really plan for the fact that the boss will be available to hit when you want to do your second or third burst in the identity. This is not as much of an issue as, say, the second Doomsday from a sorceress in her identity, because Wild Soul has a self-correcting system in the spirit stacks. Basically, if the boss is not available to hit, then your identity is just going to end. However, something that's important to know is that spirit stacks, if your identity ends, will automatically be consumed. You don't have to manually trigger the spirit stacks before your identity ends. It'll do it for you. So let's say hypothetically you have 10 stacks of spirit and the boss disappears and you can't do your second burst. What's going to happen is that your identity will end, your stacks will be consumed, and by the time the boss comes back, you're going to have all of your skills up anyways. You'll be able to rapidly build into your identity and just start from the opener again. It's really not that big of a deal for her. That's about it for this video. As always, builds are constantly changing, and we're still technically in the early release of this class, so its own class meta is subject to change, especially as it lands in the hands of Western players. Before the quality of life update a week ago, we thought that Wild Soul was just straight up mediocre damage for annoying gameplay, and a week later, she's arguably top 2 non-positional now in the entire game in terms of potential damage, coupled with relatively easy execution. Before I said that it wasn't really a meta chase class, but I'm inclined to change my mind after we've made further developments with the class. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and for those of you guys who are still curious about things about the class, feel free to comment down below and I will try to check as I see them.